Hi, students. Hope you're having a great break. I wanted to get us caught up so that we're ready to talk about long run macro equilibrium on Monday and then get ourselves ready to review on Wednesday for the exam that will be on Friday. So let's talk about short run macroeconomic equilibrium. That's our number 4 on our slide that we have seen 4 times so far. And what we're going to define short run macro equilibrium as is whenever our aggregate output supplied in the short run is equal to our aggregate output demanded, again in the short run. So from this, you can get both the equilibrium price level and quantity like we normally do, just in the aggregate. So here's a picture of what your short run macro equilibrium should look like. You will have your short run aggregate supply curve, which we've talked about, and then your aggregate demand curve. Where these two lines intersect, that's clearly your equilibrium, like it has been since August. Please notice here that there is no long run macro, long run aggregate supply curve, because we're just talking about the short run right now. Okay, so let's talk about things that can throw us out of equilibrium. First, we have a demand shock. Okay, so this is something that shifts the aggregate demand curve, and we talked about this ad nauseum. So the Great Depression, for instance, that's what we tend to use as a nice little example. That was caused by a negative demand shock. And that led to a collapse of wealth. Businesses, consumers all then fled the market, and we were left with a stock market crash, banking crisis, and very bad things happened. However, in order to get us out of the Great Depression, what we saw was that the United States entered World War II, and the government began spending. I believe we cited that on one of the earlier slides. The government started increasing their spending by about 400%. So that was a positive demand shock where the government began to spend on things, allowing us to go back towards our short and long run equilibrium. So let's look at what these positive and negative demand shocks actually look at and actually do. So first I'm going to talk about this left-hand graph, the negative demand shock. So we are at E1, where the short run aggregate supply and that light blue aggregate demand curve, or light green aggregate demand curve, intersect. We have a negative demand shock where our aggregate demand shifts to the left. And now we're sitting at, so for a given level of, say, P1 still, we're sitting at a point where short run aggregate supply, firms are willing to still supply Y1, but consumers demand something that is much less than that, the point where P1 intersects with the darker blue aggregate demand curve. So this leaves us with a surplus, right? All these suppliers willing to supply, no demanders, no consumers actually want this. So what we end up doing is moving along our short run aggregate supply curve, the price drops, and we get to point E2. That's how you see that black line showing you, those black arrows showing you that you move down your short run aggregate supply line, ending up at E2. Now look at the right hand picture where it shows you a positive demand shock. All of a sudden, people become, their expectations increase, the government starts spending more, whatever this reason is, we shift our aggregate demand to the right. And then we see producers are still saying, well, unless prices change, I'm still going to produce the exact same quantity I was before. But as prices start going up, then we move along our short run aggregate supply curve to get to this new point E2, which is at a higher price and a higher aggregate output level. So that was a demand shock. Let's talk about supply shocks now. So a supply shock, which again, we've already talked about the sources and where these come from. So that kind of set us up nicely to concisely tie this equilibrium together. So a supply shock, something that shifts the short run aggregate supply curve. Now, what is an example of this? An example of this would be the recession in 1973, as well as the 1980 recession with those oil embargoes. So basically, it was a negative supply shock as we talked about commodity prices There was a shortage in oil because the world oil supplies were disrupted because everyone was fighting. So since we had a shortage of oil, which we all know is a commodity, meaning it's a standardized input that we use in the production of, quote, all goods, then this caused a negative supply shock. Now, on the flip side, if we look at the United States and our growth between 1995 and 2000, which we call the dot-com bubble, for the most part, it's the dot-com boom. So internet and technologies were growing very quickly at this time. So what this did is this increased workers' productivity. So we talked about how an increase in paperwork can decrease our productivity, whereas all of a sudden internet comes up, faster computers, wireless, Wi-Fi, internet, things like that can increase our productivity, and that is going to lead to a positive supply shock. So let's again talk about this. We've got our pictures here showing our dark blue line of our aggregate demand curve. Light pink line is the short run aggregate supply originally. And then on the left, look at the left-hand panel, we have this negative supply shock. So our short run aggregate supply shifts to the left. And then we move along our aggregate demand curve until we get to a higher price with a lower output. So think about that. We're going to come back to this. Situation because that seems kind of painful, right? Higher prices, but no one has jobs because we're not producing as much. So we have a term for that. And we're going to get to it in just a couple slides, or a slide. Now on the right-hand side, we have a positive supply shock. So this is something that, for instance, workers were becoming more productive. So we have our light pink short run aggregate supply shifts to the right, move us down our aggregate demand curve until we were at a lower price and higher levels of output, which is great for consumers. We say this is awesome. Our basket is cheaper and we're producing more. So now, what happens when we have prices going up but output going down? This is what we call stagflation. So it's inflation that is stagnant, right? So prices are going up, but we're not seeing any change in our jobs, right? We're actually seeing we're producing less, so there's probably less people working. So this is caused by this negative supply shock that you saw on the left-hand side of the last slide. And what we can definitely agree on is that this is very unpleasant. So very unpleasant. We never want to deal with stagflation, but that is the term for prices going up, but people not producing, our economy not producing as much as we were before. So that's the end of the slideshow. I hope you all have a great rest of the weekend, and we will start on Monday with long run and talk about long run macro equilibrium to get us all finished with our topics before the second exam. And you will have chapter 12 homework that will show up after class on Monday too. So have a wonderful weekend. I hope you enjoy the weather, and I will see you all on Monday.